Welcome everybody to this, our fourth Heaventree of Stars, this wonderful, unique convergence of science and literature through a celebration of the world's greatest writer, James Joyce. The Heaventree of Stars for the last number of years has been this glorious start to our Bloomsday Festival. And we were touch and go whether we'd make it this year, but we couldn't resist. And the call of science and this convergence with the literature of James Joyce kept calling us. And here we are again. So thank you to our co-hosts, myself, Dorina Gallagher, Director of the James Joyce Centre, working closely with members of DIAS, the Dublin Institute for Advanced Studies, also Maths Week Ireland. And this year we're delighted to have Andrew Basquille from the James Joyce Museum and Tower in Sandy Cove, our wonderful performer and singer for the evening. And we're thrilled to include the PhD students from the Dublin Institute for Advanced Studies, two wonderful PhD students who are very busy working on their studies and have honoured us with their time this evening, Aoife and Pierce. So we're all very sad we can't be out in Dunsink Observatory like we have been on other years. Peter Gallagher tells us it's a beautiful evening out there, so we'll be delighted to join him in a few minutes out in Dunsink Observatory. We'll have to make do from the comfort of our own homes, so I hope you will sit back and enjoy and listen to some interesting readings and songs from James Joyce, but also reflections on science and physics and astronomy and maths. We'd like to dedicate this evening's performance to this distinguished professor of physics emeritus, Anne Kernan, who passed away in May 2020. Dr. Kernan grew up just beside me here on Griffith Avenue in the north side of Dublin and attended Dominican College on Eccles Street, which we of course know from the home place of Leopold Bloom, our citizen science in Ulysses. She also, like Joyce, attended UCD and earned her bachelor degree at the age of 19, becoming the first woman to get a first-class honours in physics from UCD and was indeed the only woman in her class. She continued at UCD and obtained her PhD in physics in 1957. And after earning her PhD, Anne spent several years lecturing at UCD before taking up research positions at the Lawrence Radiation Laboratory and the Stanford Linear Accelerator Center. In 1967, she joined the Department of Physics at UC Riverside as a lecturer and was appointed an associate professor in 1968, becoming once again the first woman to gain tenure in the department. From 1973 to 76, she was physics department chair, and from 1991 to 94, she served as vice chancellor for research and dean of graduate division, again becoming the first woman to serve in these positions. From Stanford, she moved to CERN and became one of the founding members of the UA1 experiment, where the W and Z bosons were discovered in 1983, and these led to the award of the 1984 Nobel Prize in Physics to Carlo Robbia and Simon van der Meer. In recognition of her contributions, she attended the awards ceremony in Stockholm at the invitation of the recipients. In 1986, Anne's pursuit of the high energy frontier prompted her to move to the D0 experiment, which was being constructed at the Tevatron Collider at Fermi, or Fermilab. Working at D0, her group was part of the team that went on to discover the top quark in 1995. Of course, some of you will know that quark is from Finnegan's Wake, the physicist Murray Gell-Mann, who was awarded the Nobel Prize in 1969 for his discoveries related to elementary particles, took the name quark from the lines in Finnegan's Wake: 3 quarks for Muster Mark. Sure, he hasn't got much of a bark, and sure, any he has, it's all beside the mark. Indeed, Dr. Kernan is remembered as an accomplished and successful physicist with innovative vision and a kind and generous nature. She was a highly valued professor and a mentor to many. I'd like to just celebrate Anne's years of both learning and teaching in UCD with an extract from a portrait of the artist, where Joyce presents a typical UCD physics class. And this is especially for any of the students that are here with us today, especially for Pierce and Aoife. And of course, you're not at all like these students in the physics class. So in Portrait of the Artist, the entry of the professor was signalled by a few rounds of Kentish fire from the heavy boots of the students, who sat on the highest tier of the gloomy theatre under the grey cobwebbed windows. The calling of the roll began, and the responses of the names were given out in all tones until the name of Peter Byrne was reached. Here, a deep bass note in response came from the upper tier, followed by coughs of protest along the other benches. The professor paused in his reading and called the next name, Cranley. No answer. Mr. Cranley! A smile flew across Stephen's face as he thought of his friend's studies. Try Leopardstown, said a voice from the bench behind. Stephen glanced up quickly, but Moynihan's snoutish face, outlined in the grey light, was impassive. A formula was given out. Amid the rustling of the notebooks, Stephen turned back again and said, "Give me some paper, for God's sake." "Are you as bad as that?" said Moynihan, with a broad grin. He tore a sheet from his scribbler and passed it down, whispering, "In case of necessity, any layman or woman can do it." The formula, which he wrote immediately on the sheet of paper, the coiling and uncoiling calculations of the professor, the spectre-like symbols of force and velocity fascinated and jaded Stephen's mind. He had heard some day that the old professor was an atheist Freemason. Oh, the great dull day! It seemed a limbo of painless, patient consciousness through which souls of mathematicians might wander, projecting long, slender fabrics from plane to plane of ever rarer and paler twilight, radiating swift eddies to the last verges of a universe ever vaster, farther, and more impalpable. So we must distinguish between elliptical and ellipsoidal. Some perhaps of you gentlemen may be familiar with the works of Mr. W.S. Gilbert. In one of his songs, he speaks of the billiard sharp who is condemned to play on a cloth untrue with a twisted cue and elliptical billiard balls. He means a ball having the form of an ellipsoid of the principal axis of which I spoke of a moment ago. Moynihan leaned down towards Stephen's ear and murmured, "What price ellipsoidal balls? Chase me, ladies, I'm in the cavalry." The professor had gone to the glass cases on the side wall, from a shelf of which he took down a set of coils, blew away the dust from many points, and bearing it carefully to the table, held a finger on it while he proceeded with his lecture. He explained that the wires in modern coils were a compound called platinoid, lately discovered by F. W. Martino. He spoke clearly the initials and surname of the discoverer. Moynihan whispered from behind, "Good old Freshwater Martin." "Ask him," Stephen whispered back with weary humour, "if he wants a subject for electrocution. He can have me." Moynihan, seeing the professor bend over the coils, rose in his bench and, clacking noiselessly the fingers on his right hand, began to call with the voice of a slobbering urchin, "Please, teacher, this boy is after saying a bad word, teacher." "Platinoid," the professor said solemnly, "is preferred to German silver because it has a lower coefficient of resistance by changes of temperature. The platinoid wire is insulated, and the covering of silk that insulates it is wound on the ebonite bobbins just where my finger is. If it were wound single, an extra current would be induced in the coil. Bobbins are saturated in hot paraffin wax. a sharp Ulster voice said from the bench below. Are we likely to be asked questions on applied science? Oh, there's Dunsink coming in. The professor began to juggle gravely with the terms pure science and applied science. A heavy-built student wearing gold spectacles stared with some wonder at the questioner. Moynihan's voice called from behind in echo to a distant bell. Ding-a-ling-a-ling-a-ling-a-ling! Closing time, gents! With that, I better make sure that we're about to go to Dunsink and Peter Gallagher. Peter is an Irish astrophysicist specializing in solar physics, but he is senior professor and head of astronomy and astrophysics at the Dublin Institute for Advanced Studies. But he is also director of Dunsink Observatory, where he is going to broadcast from us now. Peter, are you ready? You were coming in and out.
I sure am, Mrs. Gallagher. I'm doing fine.
Excellent.
I'm no relation there, of course. But I thought I'd start with a quote, which is appropriate for the day that's in it and being here in Dunsink. We actually had a partial solar eclipse today. And the quote goes as follows: "There will be a total eclipse this year, autumn sometime. Now that I come to think of it, that ball falls at Greenwich time. It's the clock is worked by an electric wire from Dunsink. Must go out there." Well, here we are in Dunsink Observatory. It's just about a half an hour, maybe a 40-minute cycle from Dublin city centre. And it appears that neither Bloom nor Joyce made it out to Dunsink. But this evening, I'm going to give you a little bit of a tour. Hopefully it's not too windy, of the observatory, and talk a little bit about some of the concepts that that Bloom mused over in Ulysses. What you can see behind me is one of our telescope domes, and this was in place at the time, and this was used to measure parallax of stars. And this is a concept that Bloom talks about, wondering about the distances to objects and how parallax works. And it's quite straightforward with this telescope. In fact, what you do is you look at a star at one point in the year, and then 6 months later, you look at that same area of the sky again and see if any of them have moved. And the ones that are closer to you have moved more than the ones that are further away from you. And that's the concept of parallax that so fascinated Leopold Bloom. So we'll walk on into the observatory. As I go around this corner, we'll get a swift blast of wind. So bear with me. And this is where the Royal Astronomers of Ireland, or the Astronomers Royal of Ireland, the Royal Astronomers of Ireland lived and worked right up until 1921. And actually, Bloom also talks about two of the Royal Astronomers. There's our lovely COVID signs, which are unfortunately needed at the moment. But they lived in this house, and one of the astronomers that he talked about was John Joly. And Joly was the astronomer here, and he was very much a mathematician and worked on quaternions, which William Rowan Hamilton also worked on. Another quote from this, I just turn this back around here. Another quote that's of interest and of relevance to Dunsink goes as follows: "Mr. Bloom moved forward, raising his troubled eyes." This is as he walked along the River Liffey. "Think no more about that. After one, time ball on ballast houses down, Dunsink time." Fascinating little book that is of Sir Robert Ball's Parallax. I never exactly understood. So that book was written by this gentleman here, and he was the Astronomer Royal, and he was called Sir Robert Ball, quite appropriately named Sir Robert Ball, and he was a great populist of astronomy. Worked on his great work was called the Theory of Screws. Now these screws, it sounds a little bit screwy, all right, but these screws are a mathematical way of not dissimilar to quaternions. And this is the little book that crops up in Ulysses. which is called The Story of the Heavens by Sir Robert Ball. And it's a beautiful little book that was written by him in order to popularize some of the ideas of astronomy. And of course, the first picture that I pick up here is one of a beautiful sunspot on the sun. And of course, that's spoken about by Joyce in many of his books. And lovely color illustrations here. Here's of the planet Jupiter. Okay, so that's Sir Robert Ball, which Leopold Bloom spoke about. Another concept that was of interest to him was time. And he noted that a ball on Dublin city centre, as he walked along the canal, would drop at 1 GMT every single day. Now, at the time, actually, that's a lovely, interesting optical effect, actually, as I go through that corridor. At the time, time was set from this room here that I'm going into, which is called the Meridian Room. And there are a number of clocks here on the wall that were used to set time. And actually, we recognize the quote from James Joyce here: "The time ball on the ballast house of down Dunsink time. The clock is worked by an electric wire from Dunsink, must go there." And I'm just going to open up one of these clocks and give you a listen to the ticking of one of the clocks. Beautiful, beautiful mechanics. And that time was set very accurately then within this room, which is called the Meridian Room. And I've opened up the windows in the room, and the sun is setting out to the west. There you can see the light streaming in through these windows. But above me are openings in the window, and a telescope called a Meridian telescope sat here on 2 pillars. And those pillars had a telescope, and that was then used to look at the transit of stars overhead and to work out the time. Actually, the telescope was held in place by these 2 pillars, which are now outside. You can see the beautiful views out across to the Dublin mountains, and that effectively is the Dunsink Meridian, where the passage of stars across the meridian was used to work out and set the time. And of course, that was really important to mariners, and also to banking, finance, and getting to your lectures on time. And the electric wire that is talked about in Ulysses ran directly behind me down onto the Royal Canal, and then from the Royal Canal down into the city centre, into the museum building in Trinity, but also to the Ballast House, which is just beside O'Connell Street, where the time ball used to rest, and would drop at 1 GMT every day. Of course, Bloom is quite smart here, where he says that now that I come to think of it, it's the ball that falls at Greenwich time. It's the clock that is worked by an electric wire from Dunsink. Of course, we know that due to parallax, there's 25 minutes and 21 seconds difference in time between Greenwich and Dunsink. And Leopold Bloom recognized this. So clearly did, or maybe did, understand parallax a little better than he says that he did. So I think I will leave it there. I hope you enjoy the rest of your evening, and I'll hand it back over to Darina right now. Ah, there's Pierce. Am I handing straight up? Who am I handing over to at this point?
Hi, now we'd like to welcome, thank you, Peter. We'd like to welcome one of our PhD students, Peter Murphy, who is going to read that extract about parallax for us. Just a little bit about Peter. He is a PhD student. Oh, sorry, Pierce. Sorry, I've got Peter on the brain. Pierce Murphy, forgive me, Pierce. His studies are based on the sun using radio telescopes such as ILOFAR, am I saying that right, Pierce, in Birr in County Offaly. Not only that, but solar radio bursts can give insight into the turbulent nature of the sun's atmosphere and how energy might be transferred from very large scales to the microscopic scale. So Pierce, apologies about your name, if you would like to read for us an extract about parallax from Ulysses. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Dorina, of course. Mr. Bloom moved forward, raising his troubled eyes. Think no more about that. After one. Time ball on Ballast is down. Dunsink time. Fascinating little book that is of Sir Robert Ball's. Parallax. I never exactly understood. There's a priest. Could ask him. It's Greek. Parallel. Parallax. Met in pike hoses, she called it, till I told her about the transmigration. Oh, rocks. He crossed at Nassau Street corner and stood before the window of Yates & Son, pricing the field glasses. Or will I drop into Old Harris's and have a chat with young Sinclair? Well-mannered fellow, probably at his lunch. Must get those old glasses of mine set right. Gare's lenses, 6 guineas. Germans making their way everywhere. Sell on easy terms to capture trade. Undercutting. My chance on a pair in the Railway Lost Property Office. Astonishing the things people leave behind them in trains and cloakrooms. What do they be thinking about? Women too. Incredible. Last year, travelling to Ennis, had to pick up that farmer's daughter's bag and hand it to her at Limerick Junction. Unclaimed money too. There's a little watch up there on the roof of the bank to test those glasses by. His lids came down on the lower rims of his irides. Can't see it. If you imagine it's there, you can almost see it. Can't see it. He faced about and, standing between the awnings, held out his right hand at arm's length towards the sun. Wanted to try that often. Yes, completely. The tip of his little finger blotted out the sun's disk. Must be the focus where the rays cross. If I had black glasses... Interesting. There was a lot of talk about those sunspots when we were in Lombard Street West. Looking up from the back garden. Terrific explosions they are. There'll be a total eclipse this year. Autumn sometime. Now that I come to think of it, that ball falls at Greenwich time. It's the clock is worked by an electric wire from Dunsink. Must go out there some first Saturday of the month. If I could get an introduction to Professor Joly, or learn up something about his family, that would do. Man always feels complimented. Flattery were least expected. Nobleman proud to be descended from some king's mistress, his foremother. Lay it on with a trowel. Cap in hand goes through the land. Not go in and blurt out what you know you're not to. What's parallax? Show this gentleman the door. Ah. His hand fell to his side again. Never know anything about it. Waste of time. Gas balls spinning about, crossing each other, passing. Same old ding-dong, always. Gas, then solid, then world, then cold, then dead shell drifting around. Frozen rock, like that pineapple rock. The moon. Must be a new moon out, she said. I believe there is. He went on by La Maison Claire. Wait. The full moon was the night we were Saturday fortnight. Exactly, there is a new moon. Walking down by the Tolka. Not bad for a Fairview moon. She was humming. The young May moon, she's beaming, love. He, other side of her, elbow, arm, he. Glowworm's lamp is gleaming, love. Touch, fingers, asking, answer, yes. Stop. Stop. If it was, it was. Must. That's me. Thank you.
Thank you, Pierce. That was gorgeous. Andrew, if I could hand it over to you, We have been introduced to two characters, Stephen Dedalus in his course in UCD, making a bit of a mischief and nuisance of himself, and also just there, thank you, Pierce. We had wonderful insight into the mind of Leopold Bloom. So Andrew is going to give us his song about these two wonderful characters in his ballad of Bloom, Stephen and Bloom. Thank you, Andrew.
Thank you, Dorina. Yes, it was while volunteering out in the tower, and I saw Joyce's guitar, and as we know, he had a beautiful tenor voice, and it got me thinking, supposing instead of writing a book, he wrote a ballad. So here's the story of Ulysses in 412 words, 36 lines, 18 rhyming couplets. Okay, so hang on to your hats. On the 16th of June 1904, the Tower is the place to be, with stately plump Buck Mulligan and the scrotum tightening sea. At the school on Dalkey Avenue, Stephen is a fake, and history is a nightmare from which he's trying to wake. As he walks along the strand at Sandymount, he shuts his eyes to see, and mopes and broods as though he walks into eternity. Meanwhile we meet Mr. Leopold Bloom in Eccles Street, in the inner organs of beasts and fowls, and Molly in her room. Away he goes buying lemony soap in Sweeney's in Lincoln Place, where his throwaway word gives Bantam Lines a tip for the day's big race. Then off with Martin Cunningham, Mr. Power and Stephen's da, behind poor Paddy Dignam in the Solomon funeral car. They almost meet each other in the Freeman's Journal at noon, where Stephen delivers a letter and an ad is placed by Bloom. Then Davy Byrne's Moral Pub, Leopold Lig de Ski, with a gorgonzola sandwich and a glass of Burgundy. At the door of the National Library, Stephen stands aside to let a man pass out. It's still too soon for them to collide, and Dublin is amazed at seen from different points of view, as the Viceroy, William Humble, Earl of Dudley, passes through. In the Ormond, Bloom decides to tackle Boylan as he leaves, but no, he bears no hate for him as easy stopped the sea. And the nameless debt collector tells us how in Kiernan's pub the citizen flings the biscuit tin, but Bloom ascends above. At the beach he delights in Gertie's exposition on the sly, and both of them explode like Roman candles in the sky. With parodies at Holles Street, another hour is past, ut implorenter scripturae, they meet each other at last. Then Nighttown, it's a dream play, and Stephen is undone, and Bloom, hallucinating, sees his dear departed son. Exhausted at the cabman's shelter now, it's almost 1, and they make their own communion with a coffee and a bun. So what do they do back at Leopold's gaff, when all that's to say's been said? They gaze at stars, and Stephen leaves, and Bloom heads up to bed, where Molly's soliloquying about every fond caress, till finally she says the word, oh yes, she says it, yes.
Thank you so much. So we can go home now. We've done the whole of Ulysses. Next up, I'd like to welcome Luke Drury. Luke has been part of this crazy project, the Heaventree of Stars, right from the beginning. And we're delighted that he could be with us again this evening, leading the charge on a stream of consciousness, I believe, Luke. Luke, of course, is Peter Gallagher's predecessor. So all that we said about Peter can be attributed, and I'm sure lots more, Luke. And thank you for being with us again. I know you were busy today. So yeah, if you'd like to take it away, he described this as being a little bit dangerous, so I'm very excited.
It's always dangerous to speak without a script, and I'm going to try and extemporize and just do a Joycean type stream of consciousness meditation on Bloom and popularization of science and things like that. So, I mean, I think the interesting thing that's clear from the reading we had earlier from Pierce is that Joyce gives a brilliant portrait, actually, of an ordinary person, intelligent, but with no formal training, who's actually interested in an awful lot of things. He wants to understand science, he wants to know about science, but he's constrained by the material available to him. And he's read a few popularization accounts, and Robert Ball's book, of course, features prominently as a very good example of descriptive astronomy, a genre which is still very popular. My problem with that is, I mean, it so easily descends into the you could pejoratively call the gee whiz, isn't it wonderful category, where you just list off amazing facts about the universe. And really, what we should be doing, and there's a whole industry now talking about how better to communicate science. It's become a really important, and you can just see it in the way the information about COVID is presented. How we communicate science has become very, very important. And to do that reliably in a trustworthy way is actually difficult. I mean, I think the important thing is to convey not what certainly doesn't work is just throwing facts at people. This is the so-called deficit model, that the problem is simply that people don't know the facts. That's not the issue. What we have to do actually is to convey how science works, how difficult it is, how it's generated by a community. It's not one scientist, it's a whole community of scientists criticizing each other, working, throwing ideas at each other, testing ideas, looking for evidence, and eventually coming closer to the truth. And you could see that Bloom, had he had the opportunities of a formal education, could very well have become a scientist. What's interesting, I think, if we look back on it, is that what he's not aware of is the really big problem at the time, which was the lack of detectability of the luminiferous ether. The Michelson-Morley experiment was about 10 years before this, and clearly it was expected to detect the motion of the Earth through the ether. It didn't. And Bloomsday is set in 1904. The big revolution actually was 1905, Einstein's Annus Mirabilis, where he published his special theory of relativity, which basically turned the whole thing around and said electromagnetism is fine. The problem is actually with Newtonian mechanics, and we have to change our views on time and space, and then everything fits together. So that's almost coincident with Bloomsday, which is quite an interesting coincidence. And so it's interesting to ask, if Joyce were writing today, what would Bloom be wondering about? And I think, he wouldn't be talking about Robert Ball's book, but you could well imagine that he might be remembering how in a charity shop he came across Hawking's Brief History of Time and couldn't understand it, because hardly anyone who bought the book actually understood it. And well, actually, one interesting thing just to notice is that one thing that is not in Ulysses and couldn't have been in Ulysses are charity shops. Society has changed so much. I mean, back then, items were expensive, clothes were valuable. You didn't throw things out, you mended them, you passed them on, you sold them, but you didn't donate them to charity. So that's one big change, not necessarily for the better, I think. But going back to the Brief History of Time, one thing that certainly would have fascinated Bloom would be the idea of black holes. And Joyce would certainly have had great fun with the idea. We know that Joyce quite liked scatological humor and erotic puns, and he would certainly have made much of black holes, I think. But to be more realistic, one thing Bloom would have been fascinated by would be the pictures of the massive black hole in the center of M87, which were in all the media a few years back. And he would have been wondering how on earth it was possible to make a picture of a black hole. Well, of course, it's not a picture in light, it's a picture in radio waves, but we're used to the idea now that you can make pictures in wavelengths other than visible light. But you could reasonably ask the question, how can you possibly picture something which by definition is black and emits no light whatsoever? And the answer, of course, is actually bringing us back to where we started today with the solar eclipse, that what the black hole does is it eclipses the light from glowing gas clouds behind it. So you don't really see the black hole. What you see is the shadow of the black hole passing in front of a background. And in that sense, it is analogous in some ways to an eclipse. The big difference is that, of course, whereas the moon has a very weak gravitational field and light rays just go in straight lines essentially past it. But a black hole, the gravitational field is so intense that it bends the light, and it's more like a distorting lens than an obscuring disk. So that's why the image looks a bit, well, quite complicated, but actually fits very well with computer simulations. So that really brings us back then. I mean, it's interesting to think, what would a modern day Bloom have been talking about? He wouldn't have been talking about Dunsink time, but he might possibly have picked up on Hamilton, just picking up on something Peter mentioned. 1911, so a few years after Bloomsday, the College of Science was opened, and that's now government buildings. And we could well imagine that in his walking around Dublin, Bloom might have passed what was then the College of Science, now government buildings, and seen two statues on either side. And I don't know how many politicians going in and out know that on either side they have, first of all, our greatest physicist, William Rowan Hamilton, on the other side, the father of chemistry, Robert Boyle, which rather naturally will segue you into Eoin Gill's talk later on, because he runs the Robert Boyle Summer School. So I think that was a sort of stream of consciousness, random thoughts. I think at this point I should stop and hand back to Darina. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Luke. That was fascinating. Yes, when we were planning this evening's talks, we began to think about what Bloom would think about now if he was, you know, exploring popular science and walking down the streets. So thank you, Luke, for presenting us with this modern day view of Bloom. I would like to now introduce Aoife Ryan, who's going to perform again with Pierce Murphy. Aoife is also a PhD student, and we're delighted to include students in today's or this evening's Heaventree of Stars. I think Aoife talks about in her biography that she sent to me that she's passionate about science, outreach, and communication. So. And I think everybody involved in this presentation is as well. So great to have you on board, Aoife. Aoife is also developing a technique to optimize imaging of the sun. So I don't know if today was a big day for you with eclipses as well. And also working on the using LOFAR. And so she explains for people like me that LOFAR is a radio telescope which is made up of thousands of antennas extending over a distance of 2,000 kilometers across Europe. Yeah. And in 2017, Ireland, woohoo, became a member of the LOFAR consortium with the construction of the Irish station, iLOFAR in Birr in County Offaly. So thank you to, again, we'll be having a reading from Ulysses, and these are two cronies of Bloom's walking down the streets of Dublin, a bit like Luke described earlier. Thank you, guys.
Thanks, Darina. So we'll start off with an extract from Ulysses. Here we have two characters, Lenihan and McCoy, walking through Dublin city centre. And we're going to begin with McCoy as narrator. Lenihan and McCoy walked up the steps under Merchant's Arch. The dark-backed figure of Leopold Bloom scanned books on the hawker's cart.
There he is.
Wonder what he's buying.
Leopoldo or the Bloom is on the rye.
He's dead nuts on sales. I was with him one day and he bought a book from an old one in Liffey Street for £2 bob. There were fine plates in it, worth double the money. Stars and the moon and comets with long tails. Astronomy it was about.
I'll tell you a damn good one about comets' tails. Come over in the sun.
They crossed to a metal bridge and went along Welliton Quay by the river wall.
There was a long spread out at Glencree Reformatory. The annual dinner, you know. Boiled shirt affair. The Lord Mayor was there. Val Dillon it was. And Sir Charles Cameron and Dan Dawson spoke. And there was music. Bartell D'Arcy sang, and Benjamin Dollard.
I know, my missus sang that once.
Did she? Wait till I tell you. Della Hunt of Camden Street had the catering, and yours truly was chief bottle washer. Bloom and the wife was there. Lashings of the stuff we put up. Port wine and sherry, and Curacao, to which we did ample justice. Fast and furious it was. After liquids came solids. Cold joints galore and mince pies.
I know, the year the missus was there.
But wait till I tell you. We had a midnight lunch, too, after all the jollification, and when we sallied forth, it was blue o'clock the morning after the night before. Coming home, it was gorgeous winter's night on the Featherbed Mountain. Bloom and Chris Callanan were on one side of the car, and I was with the wife on the other. We started singing glees and duets, "Lo, the early beam of morning." She was well primed, with a good load of Della Hunt's port under her belly band. Every jolt the bloody car gave her, I had her bumping up against me. Hell's delights. She has a fine pair, God bless her, like that. I was tucking the rug under her and settling her bow all the time. Know what I mean? She's gamey mare, no mistake. Bloom was pointing out all the stars and the comets in the heavens to Chris Callanan and the Jarvey, the Great Bear and Hercules and the Dragon and the whole jig-and-bang lot. But, by God, I was lost, so to speak, in the Milky Way. He knows them all, Faith. At last, she spotted a weeny-weeshy one miles away. "And what star is that, Poldy?" says she. By God, she had Bloom cornered. "That one, is it?" says Chris Callanan. "Sure, that's only what you might call a pinprick." By God, he wasn't far off the mark. Oh, I'm weak.
McCoy's white face smiled about it at instants and grew grave. Lenihan walked on again. He lifted his hat and scratched his hind head rapidly. He glanced sideways in the sunlight at McCoy.
He's a cultured all-round man, Bloom is. He's not one of your common or garden, you know. There's a touch of the artist about old Bloom.
Thank you, guys. I'm going to hand you over once again to Andrew, who's going to sing pretty much the anthem of Ulysses. Thank you, Andrew.
Yes. So this is Love's Old Sweet Song, and as you say, it is like the Joycean national anthem composed in 1884 by an Offaly man, James Lynham Malloy, words by G. Clifton Bingham, and it's typical of the parlour songs that, you know, Joyce and his friends and family would have sung at the time. Once in the dear dead days beyond recall, when on the world the mists began to fall, out of the dreams that rose in happy throng, lo, to our heart love sang an old sweet song. And in the dusk where fell the firelight gleam, softly it wove itself into our dream. Just a song at twilight, when the lights are low, and the flickering shadows softly come and go. Though the heart be weary, sad the day and long, still to us at twilight comes love's old song, comes love's old sweet song. Even today we hear love's song of yore, deep in our hearts it dwells forevermore. Footsteps may falter, weary grow the way, still we can hear it at the close of day. So till the end, when life's dim shadow falls, love will be found the sweetest song of all. Just a song at twilight, when the lights are low, and the flickering shadows softly come and go. Though the heart be weary, sad the day and long, still to us at twilight comes love's old song, comes love's old sweet song.
Oh, thank you, Andrew. I wish you could hear us all applauding. Thank you so much. Here we are. I can look out my window and it's not quite twilight, is it? But nearly. Oh, I had forgotten to say that Luke Drury reminded us that the 10th of June was the day James Joyce met Nora Barnacle. So how fitting to have such a beautiful love song, love parlor song for the day they first set eyes on each other, and this incredible romance continued from the 10th of June all those years ago in 1904. Next up on this exciting evening, I'd like to introduce Eoin Gill. Eoin is also a regular contributor to the Heaventree of Stars, and we're delighted to have him back. Eoin is director of CalMast STEM Engagement Centre at Waterford Institute of Technology. Originally an engineering lecturer, he's a keen interest in repositioning STEM in our culture. He's also founded Maths Week Ireland in 2006, which has over 2 million participants since, so really extending maths and science and technology. Although young people are a key audience, a large amount of work is also programmed for adults. As Luke mentioned earlier about Robert Boyle, Eoin founded the Robert Boyle Summer School in 2012 to create a space where we can explore the place of science within our heritage and society. So fabulous sentiment there. I wish we were all going down to Lismore now, Eoin, on a sunny June evening. It's usually this time of year you're getting ready for that. So thank you for joining us, Eoin. I'll pass you over now.
Thank you, Dorina, and thanks to Peter, Luke, the gang at Dunsink, and Des Gunning, of course. It's great to be here again, and it's great to celebrate science and in literature and literature in science. I'm going to start by telling you a story that hasn't been told publicly before, It all began in Waterford Institute of Technology in 2004, the centenary of Bloomsday. Maths lecturer Michael Brennan invited head of department of applied arts Michael Howlett to give a talk on Ulysses to the Maths Physics seminar series. As the year progressed, the Rejoice Bloomsday celebration program was published, and there was a wide variety of events exploring many aspects of Joyce and Ulysses, but nothing about science or maths or engineering. Yet I knew well these featured in his work. Though CalMast was but a couple of years old, we resolved to do something about it. I spoke to my colleague Michael Howlett, who was ideally qualified to the task with a doctorate in theology, another on Ulysses, and a BSc in physics. Michael was keen that I would do the part of explaining the STEM side, the science, technology, engineering, and maths. So we decided to do a two-hander. And we booked the library in the RIA, itself mentioned in Ulysses, and contacted the Rejoice Festival, and we were all set for the 22nd of June 2004. The festival welcomed us, but told us that we couldn't quote the book without the permission of the copyright holder, Stephen Joyce, and that they didn't want any trouble with him. They gave me his address in France, and I wrote to him requesting permission to read a selection of passages. While I was in Dawson Street one day making preparations, my colleague Sheila Donegan was in the Calmast office in Waterford. The phone rang. She answered it. "The answer is a big fat no," cried the voice at the other end. No hello, no introduction, but immediately she knew she was talking to Stephen Joyce, grandson of James Joyce and jealous guardian of the holy texts. "My grandfather leapt up out of the grave and told me to tell you no." Sheila tried to explain that we were trying to honor her grandfather, or his grandfather. "No, no, no." At every turn he shouted, "My grandfather said no." He didn't expand on his or his grandfather's reasoning, except to say our letter was very badly written and took particular offense to my having referred to the portrait instead of a portrait. He warned that he would have people at the event and would know if we dared to read anything, and his solicitors would be after us. After about 5 minutes of shouting, the man must have been exhausted and slammed down the phone. I reported this to the festival organisers, and the week before the talk, I was contacted by a journalist from the Sunday Times to ask if we had a run-in with Stephen Joyce. I was mindful of the request from the festival organisers not to upset Stephen Joyce, and naively made no comment. Naive because the journalist didn't hear it from us and certainly didn't hear it from Stephen Joyce. But I did read at the end of the talk, just out of defiance. Anyway, Joyce is now out of copyright and we can read it when we like, and in public too. So I would like to read one of the passages I read that night. It's from Ithaca, and after returning home after his wanderings, Bloom wants to make a cup of tea for himself and Stephen. Many of us, if we wanted to fill a kettle, would just go to the tap without thinking about it. Not Bloom, not Joyce. Water flows through Ulysses, and this passage recounts the passage of water. If you listen to it, I think it conveys the conveyance of water from the source through all stages of its journey to the kettle in the basement of number 7 Eccles Street. What did Bloom do at the range? He removed the saucepan to the left hob, rose and carried the iron kettle to the sink in order to tap the current by turning the faucet to let it flow. Did it flow? Yes. From Roundwood Reservoir in County Wicklow of a cubic capacity of 2,400 million gallons, percolating through a subterranean aqueduct of filter mains of single and double pipage constructed at an initial plant cost of £5 per linear yard by way of the Dargle, Rathdown, Glen of the Downs and Callow Hill to the 26-acre reservoir at Stillorgan, a distance of 22 statute miles, and hence through a system of relieving tanks by a gradient of 250 feet to the city boundary at Eustace Bridge, Upper Leeson Street. Though from prolonged summer drought, the daily supply of 12.5 million gallons, the water had fallen below the sill of the overflow weir, for which reason the borough surveyor and waterworks engineer, Mr. Spencer Harty, CE, on the instructions of the Waterworks Committee, had prohibited the use of municipal water for purposes other than consumption, envisaging the possibility of recourse being had to the unpotable water of the Grand and Royal Canals as in 1893. Particularly as the South Dublin Guardians, notwithstanding the ration of 15 gallons per head per day per pauper, supplied through a 6-inch meter, had been convicted of a wastage of 20,000 gallons per night by a reading of the meter on the affirmation of the law agent of the corporation, Mr. Ignatius Rice, solicitor, thereby acting to the detriment of another section of the public, self-supporting taxpayers, solvent, sound. Now, it does seem to be a long way of saying he filled the kettle, but Joyce packs a lot in here. The journey begins at Roundwood, in County Wicklow, where the Heaventree River was impounded, delivering a clean, abundant water supply for the city of Dublin in 1867. Before this, the water came from the Royal and Grand Canals, which was poor quality and low pressure, so the new supply was very welcome. Indeed, Heaventree water is mentioned already twice in Ulysses. Early at the Ormond Hotel, characteristic of him, power, particular about his drink, flaw in the glass, fresh Heaventree water. And later in the cabman's shelter, Stephen's mind was not exactly what you would call wandering, but a bit unsteady, and on his expressed desire for some beverage to drink, Mr. Bloom, in view of the hour it was, and there being no pump of Vartry water available for their ablutions, let alone drinking purposes, hit upon an expedient by suggesting off the reel the propriety of the cabman's shelter, as it was called, hardly a stone's throw away, near Butt Bridge, where they might hit upon some drinkables in the shape of a milk and soda or a mineral. The reservoir near Roundwood does have a capacity of 2,400 million gallons, as Joyce reports, or as Irish Water gives it now, 11.3 billion litres. The water was largely unpolluted and percolated first through large beds of sand, which removed a lot of impurities. This was the first major treatment plant on the island at the time, and at a time when London's water wasn't treated. This supply limited a lot of the waterborne illness of Dublin. The water is piped through a tunnel through Callaghill, on by the Glen of the Downs, into the barony of Rathdown, over the Dargle, and onto the reservoir at Stillorgan. Now, Joyce gives us these in reverse order. The single 33-inch mains brought the water to Stillorgan, and twin 27-inch cast iron pipes brought it into the city. The 27-acre reservoir at Stillorgan created a 10-day reservoir, a reserve for the city, and it would be well known for passengers on the Lewis. It's there at the Lewis stop at Sandyford, so they're still there and still in use for the city. The fall between Stillorgan to Leeson Street does appear to be about 250 feet, as Joyce reports, but the system of relieving tanks were between the Vartry and Stillorgan, which had a fall of about 300 metres. We know Joyce gleaned a lot of details from Tom's directory, and there was an outline account of the water supply in the directory, but Joyce must have added the extras from his own recollections or from other sources. It may surprise some, firstly, that Leeson Street Bridge actually has a name, Eustace Bridge, and secondly, that this was the boundary of the city. Indeed, it was the boundary between the corporation-controlled city and the Rathmines Township, where the wealthy retired to after a day's work in the city, and where they could pay lower rates and deny the corporation those funds to help alleviate the misery of the city's poor. Now, people familiar with the bridge may have paid attention to the two pipes crossing the canal. These were the twin 27-inch mains bringing the supply into the city. Cast on these pipes is, for those who are very observant, may have seen, Park Neville, CE engineer. Park Neville was the city engineer in charge of the Vartry supply, and he is commemorated here. And maybe that's where Kavanagh got his idea, commemorate me where there is water, though it's very discreet. His assistant was Spencer Harty, who worked on the project as well, and he succeeded Park Neville as city engineer and was the city engineer at the time of Bloomsday. In 1889, Harty was the president of the Institution of Civil Engineers of Ireland, a forerunner of Engineers Ireland, and in his presidential address, he boldly claimed that the Vartry scheme had given Dublin an unlimited supply of clean water. In 1893, though, as we hear in the passage, recourse was made to the impotable water of the canals, but this drastic step wasn't needed in 1904. We see, of course, that this time last year, there was a hosepipe ban, and we were in the same situation over 100 years later. Harty retired in 1910 on a pension of £1,000 per annum, and the 1911 census shows him living on Merrion Road across from the RDS. Next mentioned is Ignatius Rice, who was the law agent for Dublin Corporation, the chief's legal advisor. He was born in 1870, and the 1901 census shows him living with his wife, Mary Frances, at 1 Waltham Terrace, Blackrock, and reports that he had both Irish and English. The census for the Joyce family in 1901 lists James and Stanislaus as having been able to speak Irish. It does list all the boys' occupations as students, but leaves the girls blank. So thankfully, things have changed largely for the good in terms of water supply and gender equality. The Vartry scheme was an important milestone in the development of Dublin and is not to be dismissed. It benefited all citizens and relieved a lot of the disease of the city. The champion of the scheme was Sir John Gray, who lived from 1815 to 75. He was a doctor, journalist, and politician. Gray was proprietor of the Freeman's Journal, which plays a prominent part of Ulysses, not least as giving jobs to Leopold Bloom. While Park Neville is commemorated on the Pipes in Leeson Street Bridge, Sir John Gray is commemorated with a statue on O'Connell Street, which is mentioned 3 times in Ulysses. In the Heydays section, when they're in the cab on the way out to Glasnevin, we hear Mr. Power, collapsing in laughter, shaded his face from the window as the carriage passed Gray's statue. Later on, we hear he halted on Sir John Gray's pavement island and peered aloft at Nelson through the meshes of his wry smile. And then in Sirens, we have Blazes Boylan's smart tan shoes creaked on the bar floor, and before. Jingle by monuments of Sir John Gray, Horatio One-Handed Nelson, Reverend Father Theobald Matthew, jaunted, as said just before now. The Viceroy's procession winds its way through the pages of Ulysses, and the last quote sees it pass by John Gray's statue, by Nelson's pillar, and past Father Matthew further up the street, the father of the temperance movement. And so we, on the main street of our capital, commemorate the man who gave us clean water and the man who tried to stop us drinking the devil's water. Thank you.
Thank you, Eoin. I don't know. It's such a shame that you can't hear everybody laughing. That was so much fun, and so informative. Thinking of water, I asked Andrew, could he sing us a song that would reflect the theme of water in Eoin's talk, and he picked the Thomas More song, isn't it, Andrew?
Yes. And then Thomas More, probably his songs are mentioned the most in Ulysses. 28 mentions of 15 different songs, and this is the meeting of the waters. There is not in this wide world a valley so sweet as that vale in whose bosom the bright waters meet. Oh, the last rays of feeling and life must depart ere the bloom of that valley should fade from my heart, ere the bloom of that valley shall fade from my heart. Yet it was not that nature had shed o'er the scene her purest of crystal and brightest of green. 'Twas not her soft magic of streamlet or hill. Oh no, it was something more exquisite still. Oh no, it was something more exquisite still. 'Twas that friends, the beloved of my bosom, were near, who made every dear scene of enchantment more dear, and who felt how the best charms of nature improve when we see them reflected from looks that we love, when we see them reflected from looks that we love. Sweet veil of Avoca, calm I could rest in thy bosom of shade with the friends I love best, where the storms that we feel in this cold world should cease, and our hearts like thy waters be mingled in peace, and our hearts like thy waters be mingled in peace.
Oh, that was so beautiful. Thank you, Andrew. So actually perfect to accompany Owen's talk. We started off with celebrating the life of Anne Kernan, and thinking about her childhood on Eccles Street, where Leopold Bloom lived, and then studying in UCD. And I'd like to invite Aoife Ryan back to continue where we actually start, where we maybe should have started at the beginning. So we followed Stephen going to UCD and then ending up drunken in the cabman's shelter, about to have a mineral or a stale cup of coffee. But Stephen is Daedalus in A Portrait of the Artist as a young man. Begins as a small child, full of wonder for life and the universe. And we thought we'd like to reflect a little bit of that, perhaps even the wonder of Anne Kernan, and all you lovely scientists, when you were children, thinking about the world and the skies and ourselves and how we all work together. Aoife, take it away.
Thank you. An extract from A Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man. Sitting in the study hall, he opened the lid of his desk and changed the number pasted up inside from 77 to 76. But the Christmas vacation was very far away. But one time it would come because the earth moved round, always. There was a picture of the earth on the first page of his geography. A big ball in the middle of clouds. Fleming had a box of crayons, and one night during free study, he had coloured the earth green and the clouds maroon. That was like the two brushes in Dante's press. The brush with the green velvet back for Parnell, and the brush with the maroon velvet back for Michael Davitt. But he had not told Fleming to colour them those colours. Fleming had done it himself. He opened the geography to study the lesson, but he could not learn the names of the places in America. Still, they were all different places that had different names. They were all in different countries, and the countries were in continents, and the continents were in the world, and the world was in the universe. He turned to the flyleaf of the geography and read what he had written there, himself, his name, and where he was. Stephen Daedalus, class of elements, Clongowes Wood College, Sallins, County Kildare, Ireland. Europe, the world, the universe. That was his writing, and Fleming one night for a cod had written on the opposite page, Stephen Daedalus is my name, Ireland is my nation, Clongowes is my dwelling place, and heaven my expectation. He read the verses backwards, but then they were not poetry. Then he read the flyleaf from the bottom to the top till he came to his own name. That was he. And he read down the page again. What was after universe? Nothing. But was there anything round the universe to show where it stopped before the nothing place began? It could not be a wall, but there could be a thin, thin line there all around everything. It was very big to think about everything and everywhere.
Oh, thank you, Aoife. That's such a perfect way to end this evening. It's very big thinking about everything and everywhere. But I would just like to thank everyone for helping us this evening, to the Dublin Institute of Advanced Studies, and to Maths Week Ireland, all working behind the scenes, and those in the James Joyce Centre in Dublin. It's a really gorgeous collaboration, and we're thrilled that we could do it again. So thank you also to Des Gunning, who I believe was in the Mater Hospital A&E. Hello, Des, if you're there, maybe unmute yourself and say hi. Des was the inspiration behind all of this right from the beginning. Des lives in Phibsborough and along the canal on the Hamilton Way that hopefully we're, hello Des, hi. Yeah, he's all good. No harm done in the Mater A&E then. And yeah, Des has inspired us to think outside the box and really celebrate so many aspects of science and literature and culture, and we're thrilled. So thank you, Peter Gallagher. Thank you, Luke Drury. Thank you, Eoin Gill. Thank you, Pierce and Aoife, and best of luck with your studies, and hope to we don't lose you now, and that we can have you on board for next year. Thanks to Sophie for hosting us all in the background here. It's nearly, what time? 8:42. I don't know what that is in old time. We'll have to work that out. But yeah, I think we'll say goodbye unless anyone had any very important questions to ask. But I think we all really enjoyed this evening. And till next year. And next year is, of course, 2022, the big celebration of 100 years of Ulysses. So it was published on the 2nd of February on Joyce's birthday in 1922. So we have a big birthday celebration for next year's Heaventree of Stars. Hopefully in Dunsink Observatory. Any chance, Peter? Okay, thank you. And I'll say good night. Thank you again to everybody. I really enjoyed it.